When looking at the super high end, you had a choice until recently of buying an AMD 6900 XT or NVIDIA RTX 3090. Both are typically out of reach for most consumers and are aimed at those wanting the very best performance at the highest resolutions with no compromises. Obviously, that came at a cost, and with the whole GPU situation being, frankly, all over the place for the last kind of almost 2 years, it typically meant spending way over the odds for that new shiny graphics card that you always wanted. To top this off, NVIDIA recently released the RTX 3090 Ti, which further improved on the performance of the RTX 3090 by giving a small but modest performance bump, but in exchange for a lot more money, at least if we're talking kind of MSRP versus MSRP or launch price versus launch price. Well, now it's time for AMD to show what they can do by tweaking the 6900 XT, refreshing it and releasing the 6950 XT. This really is a battle of the titans. Not the NVIDIA RTX kind of titan, but the ancient Greek god ones. I was trying to be funny, all right? But before we get into that, here's a word from this video's sponsor.
Andy, what are you watching?
It's not what you think.
Wow, it's so big!
Why, thank you. It's the new AOC AG493 UCX, 49 inches of pure performance and a refresh rate of 120 Hz. It's so fast. You can even do 2 at a time.
What?
You can connect 2 devices at a time and split the screen. With FreeSync Premium Pro, a 32:9 aspect ratio and a built-in KVM, you'll be finished in no time. Gaming, I mean. What did you think I mean? Get your mind out the gutter and click the link in the description to find out more. So as always, let's talk about specs and what AMD have actually been doing. For those unaware, AMD have released 3 new graphics cards, and yes, it pains me to say because they are refreshed graphics cards, but graphics cards nonetheless. The 6650 XT, 6750 XT, and what I've got here, the 6950 XT. We do have content on the other cards on the channel and also over on eTeknix.com, so definitely make sure you check that out. So with the 6950 XT being a refresh, what's actually changed over the previous flagship 6900 XT? Well, to start with, it draws more power at 335 watts compared to the 300 watts that the 6900 XT drew, and has a faster game clock and consequent boost clock, as well as a memory clock up, sort of just up ever so slightly. And that's pretty much it. It's basically an overclocked 6900 XT with the power limit unlocked a bit. So in typical AMD fashion, they've managed to tweak the performance of the card and generate more power by doing so, which, I don't know, doesn't sound all that groundbreaking in the grand scheme of things. Though taking the game clock from 2015 MHz up to 2100 MHz, the boost clock from 2250 MHz to 2310, and the memory clock from 16 gigabits per second to 18 gigabits per second, it all kind of makes sense, I guess. More speed and more power. I'm all for that. But at a cost of over $100 over the 6900 XT's launch price of $999, I'm not so sure. I mean, come on, $999, pounds, whatever, sounds so much better than $1,099, especially considering they've not added, frankly, anything extra. So where has that extra $100 come from? I get it, R&D costs money, but without even looking at any benchmarks, I kind of feel a little bit disappointed. I mean, what we basically have here is a pre-factory overclock 6900 XT. And they're typically around $100 or so more expensive. So is that all we have here, or is there kind of more to it than first meets the eye? Well, to find out, we have to do it the best way we know how, by throwing it into our full suite of benchmarks and games on our GPU test system, based around the Asus Crosshair 8 Dark Hero X570 motherboard, and paired with 32GB of Corsair Dominator Platinum, 3600 MHz memory, and a Ryzen 9 5900X, which is nicely cooled by the Noctua NHD15S. We have kept resizable bar or smart access memory disabled for those with older GPUs, so you can make a clear comparison with their kind of own hardware and compare it to ours, and to keep things as fair as possible. If you want to find out more about the test system, the links for each part are listed down below. And with that out of the way, let's get straight into the tests. Starting with 3D Mark FireStrike, and that's where we see our first performance boost over the reference 6900 XT of 2%. While the graphics score actually did see a slightly higher uplift, the overall score wasn't actually affected that much, but being an older benchmark, let's see how some newer stuff fares, which actually moves me on to FireStirke Ultra, which sees a slightly heftier 7% increase on the overall score and 8% on the graphics score. I mean, this is good, but it's not exactly groundbreaking, though compared to NVIDIA, it does now put AMD ahead in this benchmark. In 3D Mark Timespire, we see similar gains yet again of around 6% on the overall score compared to the 6900 XT, though this still puts AMD slightly behind the 3090 Ti from NVIDIA. In Timespire Extreme, it's the same story again. The already powerful 6900 XT has a small boost of around 6%, yet still falls short of the 3090 Ti and actually sits 1 point behind the 3080 Ti. Though being a similar price, is there really much to discuss there? In Port Royal, being a ray tracing based benchmark, NVIDIA were always going to have the upper hand, and that shows. Even though the 6950 XT saw a 7% increase in performance, it still falls quite wildly behind most of the 30 series cards. Maybe, who knows, next generation AMD cards will offer up better ray tracing performance. We'll have to wait and see. In our last synthetic benchmark, again, a small but modest 7% increase in performance is seen over the reference 6900 XT, though the likes of the 3090 Ti still managed to beat it by around 1600 points, and the 3080 Ti sits behind by around 200 points. So let's move on to some game performance, starting with Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The 6900 XT at 1080p was already ahead by quite some margin, and the 6950 XT just improved on that by around 7%. Though at such a high frame rate, it's kind of a redundant point. At 1440p, that lead further improves from 119 FPS to 129 on the new card when comparing to the 6900 XT, and again, further widens the gap between any of the top tier NVIDIA cards. At 4K, we see our best performance increase yet, with a 9.4% improvement over the 6900 XT, which was actually sitting behind the 3090 Ti, and allows AMD to take back that crown in this title. Moving on to Borderlands 3, and NVIDIA come out on top here. There's still a nice performance bump from the 6900 XT by 7%, yet it's not enough to catch up with the 3090 Ti at 1080p. And the same is shown at 1440p as well. The extra performance is a nice touch, but NVIDIA's 3090 Ti is just too strong here, though whether that's worth the extra money is entirely up to you. For me, it's just not. At 4K, it's the same story again, with the more expensive card beating the 6950 XT, but based on pricing, it's not as clear cut as just winning. The 6950 XT is the better value for money GPU between them. In Dirt 5, we see an almost 10% gain over the 6900 XT, though even with that, it falls short compared to pretty much every card from the 3080 12GB and up. Considering a card like the 3080 12GB is around the same price as the 6950 XT, it's becoming a bit tougher to recommend based on this, and it's the same story as we move up to 1440p, with a smaller 5% performance improvement, which at 166 frames per second, I can't see you being mad about it. But the 3090 Ti does come in at almost 30 FPS more. At 4K, that gap draws a bit closer, and the improvement is a bit smaller between the two AMD cards, but still come in with very respectable numbers. I think it's safe to say that NVIDIA just have the upper hand when it comes to this title. In Godfall, we saw things repeating itself again. Yes, there was a 5% increase in performance at 1080p, but that still puts the 6950 XT behind both the 3090 Ti as well as the 3080 Ti, though it does place the card ahead of the bog standard 3090. At 1440p, the gap narrows slightly, putting the 6950 XT just behind the 3080 Ti, but still quite some margin behind the 3090 Ti. Though at over 200 frames per second, no one's going to notice an extra 20 FPS. At 4K, again, that gap narrows slightly and still shows a 7% increase over the 6900 XT, but still falls short of the 3090 Ti. Though when looking at value for money, the 6950 XT wins all day long in comparison to that card. Moving over to Horizon Zero Dawn, and we see that before the 6950 XT, NVIDIA came out on top ever so slightly, whereas that small bump in performance on the 6950 XT manages to put AMD ahead, albeit by 4 frames per second. While at 1440p, both the 3090 Ti and 6950 XT come in with the same performance. And again, from a value for money perspective, the AMD card is the better buy. In a turn of events at 4K, the 3090 Ti did manage to storm ahead of the 6950 XT by a whopping 16%, so a real kind of mixed bag of results here. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the 6900 XT was already ahead of all the cards from NVIDIA, with the 6800 XT actually being the best performing. Weird. The 6950 XT further improves on that and pushes ahead of the 6900 XT by another 10 frames per second, putting it around 7% faster than the 3090 Ti at 1080p. At 1440p, it's very much a similar story, with the 6950 XT pushing ahead, showing that the improved clock speed really has made a difference, though the gap with the 3090 Ti does draw ever so closer. And then at 4K, things start to go a bit backwards, with the 3090 Ti taking the lead by around 8% or so. Again, being a card that is typically around 80% more in cost, I think it's safe to say AMD win here again. In Watch Dogs Legions, the NVIDIA cards all fared very similar to the 6900 XT, and in a weird turn of events, the 6950 XT actually performed slightly worse, albeit by 2 frames per second at 1080p. As we move up to 1440p, again, results are all very similar, and I feel we're being more restricted by the game than the cards themselves, though it's still clear that the 6950 XT is the better card based on its performance when compared to both the 6900 XT and the NVIDIA cards. When we move up to 4K, again, we see the 3090 Ti push ahead, though we still see a 8% performance uptake when comparing the 6900 XT and 6950 XT against each other. So with rasterisation performance out the way, let's take a look at ray tracing, starting with Dirt 5. As expected, even with a hefty 12% increase in performance over the 6900 XT, the 6950 XT still falls behind most of the high-end cards from NVIDIA at 1080p. And then, even moving up to 1440p, it's exactly the same story. There's a smaller increase in performance with the refresh, but not enough to come anywhere close to the 3090 Ti. At 4K, things start to narrow, but performance is so close between the likes of the 3080 12GB and the 6950 XT that there's nothing really to shout home about. Performance gets lifted by around 6% over the 6900 XT, but NVIDIA still managed to come out on top with the 3090 Ti. But for the extra cost involved, is that really a victory? At 1440p, again, we see the same bump we've seen through all of our tests due to the higher clock speeds, but not enough to fend off the competition, with the RTX 3080 10GB and up all beating the 6950 XT. And without repeating myself too much, it's the same situation all over again at 4K. Now, we know NVIDIA have the upper hand when it comes to ray tracing, and that's very clear to see. Booting up Metro Exodus and looking at data between the 6900 XT and the 6950 XT, and again, another 8% performance increase. Nothing to grumble at, but at $100 more when comparing launch prices, is that extra cost worth it to you? At 1440p, it's the same again, though NVIDIA still managed to push ahead in our tests on a variety of cards at all similar prices. The gap between the older card and the refresh is a lot closer at 4K, and still massively behind the likes of the 3090 Ti, and some of the other 30 series cards too. Lastly, taking a look at the performance in Watch Dogs Legions with ray tracing set to Ultra, and we see similar gains to what we've already seen of around 6% when comparing the two AMD cards. The NVIDIA cards all sit higher, again showing that upper hand when it comes to ray tracing, and the same is shown at 1440p as well, with a small boost, but not enough to stick it to NVIDIA. At 4K, the extra 2 FPS is a nice touch, but at 27 FPS overall, I don't think you'll be playing at those settings. Okay, so lots to talk about, but first, let's talk about the card we actually tested, the 6950 XT Gaming OC from Gigabyte. While it looks like your typical gaming OC card, it's definitely been at the gym, coming in with a slightly thicker design, though still nowhere near the thickness of the RTX 3090 Ti Gaming OC that was recently launched. That bad boy is hench, though this is still quite large, coming in at 332mm long, 143mm high, and 57mm thick, making it a 2.5 slot card. Overall, the design is kind of typical of what you'd expect from a gaming OC card. And that's not a bad thing, because it's a tried and tested design that fits in with pretty much any theme or colour scheme your PC may have. It does have the I'm going to admit, probably world's smallest amount of RGB on the Gigabyte logo, which can of course be controlled through RGB fusion. And I fear it's actually so small that you could easily miss it. Kind of makes me think, what's the point in having it at all? Underneath the 3 large fans and the shroud with the mesmerizing RGB, Gigabyte have changed things up a little bit. Instead of opting for a conventional copper plate heatsink like we saw with the 6900 XT gaming OC, they've actually decided to plump for a large vapor chamber with heatsink cooler, and this actually makes direct contact with both the GPU and the VRAM, and now includes 8 heat pipes instead of 6 as seen on the 6900 XT. On top of this, the fans have been bumped up from 3 80mm fans up to 3 100mm fans instead. I guess that extra power and performance needed that extra cooling, and could be the reason for the card being thicker than its little brother. So speaking of power, this is a little bit more powerful than a 6900 XT, and that shows in the total power draw, where we see the 6900 XT at 425 watts total and the 6950 at 505 watts. Still massively behind the 3090 Ti. Along with that power, obviously there is something to consider when it comes to temperatures, and this is actually quite surprising. Yes, the 6900 XT is a reference card that we tested, so that came in at 89 degrees at load, whereas the 6950 XT, being a gaming OC and is a tried and tested cooler, it comes in at 67 degrees. And also along with temperatures, you have to consider the acoustics, and the 6950 XT was a little bit louder than the 6900 XT reference at 42 decibels, but when comparing against all the MSI 3080 cards and 3090 and 3090 Ti cards, well, yeah, you can clearly see the difference. In terms of kind of things that have changed under the hood, the card actually comes pre-factory overclocked above the new increased specs from AMD. So while the 6950 XT as far as a reference spec comes in, above the 6900 XT, this is just slightly more. So the reference spec comes in at 2100 MHz on the game clock. This card improves on that ever so slightly at 2116. It also consequently pushes the boost clock from 2310 MHz on a reference 6950 XT up to 2324 MHz, while the memory clock stays the same, though that is actually a nice bump up from the 16 gigabits per second on the 6900 XT up to now 18 gigabits per second on the 6950 XT. So we have a bit more power, and it showed that it makes a difference, especially when comparing it to the 6900 XT. I mean, it's a good move for some small gains, but overall, it's not even about the size of those gains, but more about how it cements AMD in the lead over NVIDIA from a variety of different angles. I mean, we all knew AMD had a great product with the 6900 XT, especially when it came to pure rasterisation performance, and it simply improves on that. And the beauty of it all is that they didn't even need to really beat NVIDIA's top tier card, because that is so much more expensive. And that reminds me of the kind of, I don't know, AMD of old, beating the competition and doing it for less money, kind of like they used to do with the mobile XP processor days and sticking it to Intel. There was, I don't know, it's one of the reasons I actually got into PCs in general, because in a weird way it was kind of cheap enough to do because of AMD. It's also nice to see some small improvements in ray tracing, which we all know NVIDIA are the kings on. Remember, they are all in. But not everyone cares about it, along with the likes of DLSS. So that's really down to, I guess, each individual, what you prefer. Is the 6950 XT worth it over a 6900 XT? Well, as the card is due to potentially replace it, you'll kind of be left with no choice. And from a value for money perspective, it's definitely the best there, because the 3090 Ti is just too damn expensive. The other thing you have to think about is kind of what's around the corner, what's coming next. We've all seen the rumour mill about the next generation of cards from both AMD and NVIDIA, with them potentially being very, very soon. I mean, I don't even know myself, but potentially being right around the corner. Are you actually better off waiting? Well, with anything GPU related at the moment, it's a tough one to call. For me, personally, I'd probably wait, because even if the new cards don't offer what you want, at least you'll know. And we'll then probably be able to pick one of these up for potentially even cheaper in the near future. If, of course, stock is available, because we all know how that's been. What a fun world we live in, right? Well, yeah. Hopefully with that, you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it's given you a bit of an indication as to what you want to do and where you're going to go with your system. If you did enjoy this, a like on the video would be great, and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you appreciate the huge work that we put into benchmarking all these cards, then you can support us through Patreon, where we'll be putting all of the charts you saw today up for you to look at. The link is down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.